Story 1, I used to work the late shift as classroom IT support for a college. Night classes didn't give us a lot of urgent calls, so most of the time, my job involved repairs and maintenance that couldn't be done during the day when the rooms were full of students. Honestly, I didn't mind the quiet, fewer distractions, and no rush to finish up. I wasn't one to turn on classroom lights unless I absolutely needed to. I was used to the dark, and flipping switches just seemed like a waste of time if I was only going to be there for a few minutes. That night was no different. It was around 10 p.m. when I got to this ticket. Install some software on the instructor PC in a classroom I hadn't been to before. The room was tucked away in one of the older wings of the building, the kind of place you wouldn't stumble across unless you were looking for it. I found the room easily enough. The door was unlocked, which was normal for night maintenance. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the door creaking like something out of a bad horror movie. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of exit signs near the ceiling and whatever little bit of moonlight managed to sneak in through the small windows. I could barely make out the outlines of desks and chairs arranged in neat rows. Typical classroom setup. No big deal, I thought. In and out. 5 minutes, tops. I started walking across the room toward the instructor's desk near the front. My sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, echoing a bit in the empty space. That was when it hit me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and this intense, overwhelming feeling washed over me, like I wasn't alone. And not just that I was being watched, but surrounded. It was immediate and visceral, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, I couldn't move. I blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness. My eyes slowly started making sense of the shadows around me. And then I saw them. People. They were sitting up in beds along the walls. Hospital beds, angled slightly outward, forming a rough circle around the room. Every single one of them was looking right at me. My stomach dropped like I'd stepped off the edge of a cliff. They weren't moving, just sitting there stiff and silent. Their eyes locked onto me. Some of their faces were gaunt and pale, skin stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. Others looked more whole, but their expressions were all wrong. Too blank, too still. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to back away, to turn and bolt out the door, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I just stood there, frozen in place, staring back at them. "Oh, I'm sorry," I blurted out without thinking. The sound of my own voice echoed through the room, harsh and jarring against the heavy silence. Nobody responded. Nobody moved. I took a shaky step back, my brain scrambling for some kind of logical explanation. This had to be a mistake, right? Maybe it was a nursing simulation lab or something. Maybe these were just mannequins used for training. But no, these weren't mannequins. I could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests as they breathed. I could hear the faint rustle of sheets as one of them shifted slightly in their bed. This wasn't a simulation. My breath hitched as my gaze landed on the figure closest to me. A woman with stringy hair hanging limply around her face. Her eyes were glassy and unblinking, but there was something horribly alive about her presence. I took another step back, my heel catching on the edge of a desk. I stumbled but caught myself just before I fell. And then, as if on cue, every single head in that room turned to follow my movement. Slow, precise, in perfect unison. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Adrenaline kicked in, and I spun around, sprinting for the door like my life depended on it. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gas. The door was closer than I remembered, but it still felt like miles away. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty room, drowning out everything else. I reached the door, slammed my hand against the push bar, and practically fell into the hallway as it flew open. The lights in the corridor were bright and harsh, making me squint after the darkness of the room. I stood there panting, my hands on my knees as I tried to catch my breath. When I finally worked up the nerve to glance back over my shoulder, the classroom was empty. No beds, no people. Just rows of desks and chairs, exactly like every other room in the building. I blinked, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing or not seeing. What the hell just happened? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. All I know is that I never went back to that room again, and I made damn sure to turn the lights on every time I walked into a classroom after that. Story 2. It was a 2-mile walk from the pub to my house, and I'd made that trip hundreds of times. Usually it was quiet. Just me, the crickets, and the occasional rustle of something in the woods nearby. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that night was different. My shift ended around 11 p.m. I stayed for a couple of drinks since the crowd was good, and I'd made nearly $400 in tips. That was a rare thing for me, so I wanted to celebrate a bit before heading home. The pub was small, out in the boonies, and the only place for miles where folks gathered for a pint. But as peaceful as the area usually was, walking that road at night was something else. There was only one streetlight on the entire stretch, a single flickering bulb about a quarter mile from the pub. Past that, pitch black darkness. No houses, no passing cars, just endless trees and fields. Even on a clear night, it could be eerie. But this night was cloudy, and the moon wasn't giving me any help. I couldn't see a damn thing beyond the faint glow of that one streetlight. I'd only been walking for a couple of minutes when I heard a car coming up behind me. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I stepped off to the side of the road to let it pass. The car slowed as it went by, which was weird. People didn't usually crawl down this road at night unless they were lost or up to no good. It rolled past me and stopped about a quarter mile ahead, right under the streetlight. Just sat there, engine idling. I froze. I didn't know why, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching, waiting. Eventually, the car started moving again, slowly creeping away until its taillights disappeared into the dark. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were checking directions or looking for a house. It wasn't my business. But before I even made it another 100 yards, I heard the engine again. The same car was coming back toward me, this time on the opposite side of the road. It passed by slowly, just like before. My heart started thudding in my chest. When it got a little farther down the road, it slowed to a stop again. I could barely breathe. Then the driver did a U-turn, and I saw the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. The headlights went off. The car was creeping toward me in complete darkness now. No lights, just the quiet growl of the engine getting closer and closer. I panicked. I didn't have a phone on me back then, and there wasn't a single house nearby. The pub was too far behind me, and my house was still over a mile away. I was completely alone. I bolted off the road and into the woods, ducking down behind a thick bush. My breathing was loud, and I tried to force myself to stay quiet. I couldn't see much, but I strained my ears, listening for the car. The engine cut off, leaving a terrifying silence. Then I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. The car doors opening and slamming shut. Oh God, they were getting out. My chest felt like it was going to explode. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I didn't dare move. I stayed crouched low, praying they wouldn't find me. The underbrush crackled softly somewhere nearby, and I was sure they were searching the woods. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were close. I imagined someone sneaking up behind me, grabbing me before I could scream. I fought the urge to vomit, my whole body trembling. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Every little sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me think they were right on top of me. I gripped the ground like it would somehow anchor me there, invisible. Then finally I heard it. The car doors again, slamming shut. The engine roared to life, and the tires crunched against the gravel as the car sped away. I waited and waited. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched in the dirt, too scared to move. But eventually the silence returned, and it was just me and the crickets again. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. I stumbled back to the road, heart still racing. The street was empty, the darkness stretching on as far as I could see. I didn't waste any time. I walked as fast as I could without running, afraid that if I looked over my shoulder, I might see those headlights again. But they never came back. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window in the house and sat in the dark, heart pounding like a drum. I never figured out who was in that car or what they wanted. But I know one thing. I was damn lucky they didn't find me that night. And I never walked home from the pub again. Story 3. Working overnight shifts wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and I liked the solitude. I was the night manager of a 24-hour fast food joint in a town so small that most folks didn't even lock their doors. The night shifts dragged on in eerie silence, except for the hum of the fryers and the occasional car pulling up to the drive-thru. It was just me in the building most nights. Sometimes I'd have one other crew member, but they usually clocked out by 2 a.m., leaving me to handle the slow trickle of orders alone. There was something about being in charge of an entire place by yourself that made the air feel different. Heavier, like the shadows clung to you just a bit longer than they should. On this particular night, things had been dead quiet. No cars for nearly an hour. Even the usual drunken stumblers who hit the drive-thru on their way home from the bar hadn't shown up. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional crackle of static in my headset from the drive-thru speaker. I was leaning on the counter by the register, flipping through my phone, trying to keep my eyes open when it happened. First, just a faint sound, soft and rhythmic, almost melodic. I straightened up, thinking maybe a car had pulled up and I'd missed the ding. But the screen was blank. No cars. Just darkness, stretching out to the edge of the parking lot where the streetlights barely touched. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. A low, warbling coo. At first I thought it was some glitch in the system. Maybe interference from a nearby radio or a bird nesting somewhere near the speaker box. But it didn't stop. The sound filled my headset, echoing right into my ear like something was sitting inches away from me, making that strange, mournful noise. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking a bit. No response. Just that damn cooing, steady and deliberate, like it was meant for me. I yanked the headset off and stood there, heart thudding against my ribs. The drive-thru speaker crackled again, even louder now, the cooing twisting into something almost human. A laugh, maybe, but garbled, wet, like someone trying to mimic a bird and failing miserably. I stared at the monitor, willing it to show me something, anything. A car, a bird. Hell, even a raccoon would have made sense. But there was nothing out there, just darkness. The cooing stopped abruptly, cutting off like someone had hit a switch. I exhaled shakily, telling myself it was just my imagination, a combination of sleep deprivation and paranoia from being alone in a building filled with flickering fluorescent lights and buzzing machines. I grabbed the headset and slipped it back on, ready to brush it off as a weird technical glitch. And then I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't coming through the speaker. It was inside, right behind me. My stomach dropped, and every hair on my body stood on end. I turned slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. The dining area was empty, the tables and chairs arranged neatly like they always were. Nothing out of place. But I knew what I'd heard. The cooing came again, louder, closer, like whoever or whatever was making that sound was just a few feet away. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. Just the same empty restaurant I'd been standing in all night. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I took a step toward the dining area, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air felt colder now, heavy with something I couldn't name. That's when I saw it. By the corner booth near the window, barely visible in the dim light, was a shadow. It wasn't shaped like a person, not exactly. It was low to the ground, hunched, with what looked like wings folded tightly against its body, and it was moving. Not walking, but gliding across the floor without making a sound. The cooing started again, louder and more insistent, filling the entire room. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection from outside, something explainable. But then it turned its head, and I swear to God it looked right at me. I didn't think, I just ran. Bursting through the kitchen door, I sprinted toward the back exit, my shoes skidding on the slick tile floor. The cooing followed me, echoing off the walls, growing more frantic with each step I took. I slammed through the back door and into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows across the asphalt. For a moment, everything was still, silent. Then just as I was starting to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it one last time. The cooing, soft, distant, but unmistakable, coming from the drive-thru speaker. I didn't go back inside until the morning crew showed up. Even then, I couldn't explain what had happened. No birds nesting near the speaker, no signs of anyone or anything inside the building. Just that memory, the sound of something that wasn't quite a bird and wasn't quite human, cooing into my ear like it had been waiting for me all night. I quit the job a week later. Never worked nights again. Story 4. I used to work night shifts as a prison guard at a maximum security facility deep in the Appalachian Hills. The place always had this weight to it, thick and heavy, even when nothing was happening. I chalked it up to the constant tension in the air. You don't put that many dangerous people behind concrete walls without feeling it in your bones. Most nights were quiet, at least on the surface. There was always an underlying hum of fear and control, but you learned to live with it. I was on my usual patrol when I got a call from the control room to check the kitchen. Routine stuff. They'd had trouble with a sensor glitch earlier, and they wanted to make sure nobody was sneaking around where they shouldn't be. The kitchen sat on the far side of the facility, behind thick steel doors that locked tight during non-working hours. When I got there, the air was dead still, colder than the rest of the prison. That wasn't unusual, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it across the gleaming stainless steel counters and spotless floors. The kitchen was spotless, just like it was supposed to be. Everything was where it should be. Pots hanging neatly on their hooks, cutting boards stacked on the shelves, the big walk-in fridge humming softly in the corner. But then I saw it. Right there in the middle of the prep counter was a knife. Not just any knife either. A long, heavy chef's knife with a polished blade that caught the beam of my flashlight like it was trying to blind me. My stomach dropped. Every sharp in this kitchen was supposed to be locked up and accounted for at the end of the shift. Twice. First by the kitchen staff under supervision, then by the guard assigned to secure the area. No exceptions. If a knife was left out, it meant one of two things. Somebody had screwed up big time, or someone had left it there on purpose. And I knew which one made more sense in a place like this. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swept the light around again, slower this time, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. The place was empty, silent, but that knife didn't just leave itself out. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my breathing steady. Control, this is Unit 4. I've got a situation in the kitchen, I said into my radio. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. There was a crackle of static, then silence. Control, you copy? I tried again. Nothing. Great. Either the signal was blocked or the radio was acting up. I was on my own. My head was on a swivel as I made my way toward the knife, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I had to report it in person now, and leaving an unsecured weapon lying around wasn't an option. I reached the counter and hesitated for a second before grabbing the handle. It was cold, too cold, like it had just come out of a freezer. I tried not to think about that as I slid it into the sheath on my belt. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffle just behind me. I whipped around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The kitchen was still empty, but I knew what I'd heard. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sharp. No answer. I took a slow step back toward the exit, my pulse hammering in my ears. I kept the light moving, scanning every inch of the room. My hand hovered near the baton on my belt. I wanted to draw it, but something told me it wouldn't help. Another sound, closer this time, a faint, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I shined the light toward the source of the sound, heart racing. Nothing. The air felt thicker now, pressing down on me like a weight. It was hard to breathe, hard to think. I just wanted to get out of there, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the far end of the kitchen near the walk-in fridge. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. I took a shaky step back, then another. The shadow didn't follow. It just stayed there, like it was waiting for something. My back hit the swinging door, and I fumbled for the handle, never taking my eyes off that thing. The door creaked open, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the captain's office. My knuckles were white as I gripped the doorframe. "Knife!" I managed to choke out between gasps. "Left out. In the kitchen." The captain's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" I pulled the knife from my belt and set it on his desk. "Found this on the counter. Dark kitchen. Heard something." His expression hardened. "You sure?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, I'm sure." He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the knife like it was a loaded gun. Finally, he picked up the phone and started barking orders to lock down the kitchen and review the security footage. I never found out what the shadow was, or if anyone else saw it on the cameras. But I never went back to that kitchen alone again. Some things are better left unexplained. Story 5. I've worked in the ER for a few years now, mostly night shifts. It's quiet when it's quiet, but when it's bad, it's like all of hell came through the doors at once. I've seen all kinds of things on those long nights, stuff that'll stay with me forever. But there's one night that stands out, one night that still makes me question what the hell I really saw. It was around 3 in the morning, the time when things either slow down completely or take a sudden nosedive into chaos. That night had been unusually calm for once. No ambulances screaming in, no frantic family members pacing the waiting room, just the hum of the air conditioner and the soft tap of my fingers on the keyboard at the front desk. I was alone at the station. The nurses were in the back handling a couple of patients, and the security guard had stepped out for a smoke. I was halfway through charting some routine paperwork when I heard the front doors slide open with that familiar mechanical hiss. I looked up out of habit, expecting to see someone stumbling in, or maybe just a late-night visitor. But there was nothing. No one. At first I thought maybe it was a sensor glitch. It happens sometimes, especially when the wind catches just right near the entrance. Still, something felt off. I stood up and walked toward the vestibule, the small glass enclosure between the outside doors and the waiting room. The place was empty, silent. I leaned forward to peer through the glass, thinking maybe someone was just hanging back by the parking lot. But there wasn't a single soul outside. No cars, no people. Just the empty lot glowing under the pale, flickering light of the overhead lamp. I should have left it at that, chalked it up to faulty sensors and gone back to my desk. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't shake, and then I saw it. Right there, in the middle of the vestibule floor. Blood, a massive pool of it. Dark, thick, and spreading across the white tiles like something straight out of a nightmare. I froze. My brain couldn't process it at first. It didn't make sense. There hadn't been any trauma patients brought in tonight. No accidents, no violent cases. Where the hell had this much blood come from? I forced myself to move, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I hit the call button on my radio, my voice cracking as I paged the nurses. "We've got a situation up front," I managed to say. "I need backup, now." Within seconds, 2 nurses came rushing down the hallway, their faces etched with concern. "What's going on?" one of them asked, her voice sharp with urgency. I didn't even answer. I just pointed. Their eyes followed my hand, and when they saw the blood, both of them stopped dead in their tracks. "Oh my God," the other nurse whispered. We all stood there for a moment, the silence thick and suffocating. The smell hit me next, metallic and raw, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. "Did someone come in?" the first nurse asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said. "Doors opened, but no one walked in. I checked outside. There's no one there." "That's impossible," she said. "There's no way this much blood just shows up." But it had. We moved cautiously closer, our shoes squeaking on the slick floor. The blood was real. It glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, thick and vivid. "Check the perimeter," the second nurse said, trying to sound composed but failing miserably. "Maybe someone collapsed outside." I nodded and headed back toward the entrance. I stepped outside into the cold night air, my breath coming out in ragged clouds. I scanned the parking lot again, every shadow, every corner. Nothing. The lot was empty, not a single sign of a person or a vehicle. I walked back inside, my skin crawling. "No one," I said. "It's clear." The nurses exchanged nervous glances, their professional masks slipping just a little. "We need to call security," one of them said. I agreed. We paged the guard, but there was no response. "Weird," I muttered. "He was just out there." One of the nurses knelt by the edge of the blood pool, her hand hovering just above it, like she was afraid to touch it. "This much blood," she trailed off. "There's no way someone would just walk away after losing this much." But there was no body, no trail, just that endless, horrifying pool of blood in the middle of an empty room. Suddenly, the automatic doors hissed again, making all of us jump. We whipped around, hoping to see anyone walk through. But the doors just slid open and closed on their own, like they were mocking us. "Sensor glitch," I said, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. But it didn't feel like a glitch. The nurse stood up, wiping her hands on her scrubs, even though she hadn't touched anything. "We need to report this," she said firmly. "Now." We started backing away from the blood, none of us wanting to stay near it any longer than necessary. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. And then, the blood was gone. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, where there had been a massive pool of blood just seconds ago, there was now nothing. The floor was spotless. The nurses saw it too. I could tell by the way their faces went pale, their breaths hitching in their throats. "What the?" one of them started, but she couldn't finish. None of us could. We stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. The blood had been there. We had seen it, smelled it, and now it was gone, like it had never existed in the first place. I don't know how long we stood there, the three of us caught in some kind of collective disbelief. Eventually, one of the nurses broke the silence. "We're not talking about this," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Ever." We all nodded, too rattled to argue, and we didn't talk about it. Not then, not ever. And I know it wasn't just in my head. Story 6, I used to work overnight phone support for enterprise customers in the APAC region, which was basically the corporate version of a ghost town. We were lucky if each person on shift got 3 or 4 calls a week. Most of the time, it was just a bunch of us spread out across an old warehouse turned office with dim, buzzing lights overhead. The building had this weird vibe right from the start. It used to be a shipping and receiving warehouse, and you could still tell by the way sound carried in strange echoes through the high ceilings. And those damn sodium vapor halogen lights. They made everything look sickly yellow and washed out. It was like standing inside a horror movie filter. So naturally, we all petitioned to have the lights turned off at night. It was supposed to make things more relaxing. Yeah, right. This one night, I was halfway through my shift, bored out of my mind and watching Frailty on my laptop with headphones on. Not exactly a feel-good flick, but it was something to pass the time. The place was dead quiet except for the occasional hum of a server and the distant clack of someone typing. I remember it was one of the tense moments in the movie. Everything on screen had gone still, and the music was all low and ominous. I was totally sucked in when I heard it. A growl. It was low, guttural, and way too close. I ripped my headphones off and spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the same empty rows of cubicles stretching out in every direction, their partition walls barely reaching chest height. I blinked, rubbed my ears, and figured it was just some weird sound bleeding from the movie into real life. That happens sometimes, right? I shook it off and tried to laugh at myself as I went back to the film. A couple of minutes later, there it was again. That same growl, but this time it was louder. And it wasn't coming from my headphones. It was behind me. I froze, blood turning ice cold. I wasn't hearing things. This was real. I tapped my coworker Dave, who sat a few desks away, leaned in and whispered, "Hey, do you hear that?" He pulled off his headset, frowned, and tilted his head to listen. The growl came again. Dave's eyes went wide. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. We both stood up, adrenaline kicking in as we started moving toward the sound. The office was massive, with cubicles laid out in a grid that seemed to stretch forever in the dim light. We crept down the rows, our footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. At first, I thought maybe a stray dog had gotten inside somehow. The building was old and weird stuff happened sometimes, like raccoons getting into the server room. But this didn't sound like a dog. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like something trying to speak but not quite forming words. We followed the sound to the far corner of the cubicle farm, near the old freight doors that hadn't been used in years. The air felt heavy back there, like it was thicker somehow. And then I heard it again, right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over myself, expecting to see, I don't know what, a dog, a person, but there was nothing, just empty space. "Did you see that?" I asked Dave, my voice shaking. He shook his head, his face pale. "No, but I heard it. Right there." He pointed behind me. We stood there for what felt like forever, just staring into the shadows, our breaths shallow and quick. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched, that didn't go away. We didn't stick around to see if it would come back. I practically dragged Dave back to the front of the office, where the lights were a little brighter and the weird heaviness in the air lifted. Neither of us said much after that. We just sat at our desks, pretending to work, ears straining for any hint of that sound again. It never came back. I don't know what it was that night. I don't even want to guess. But I can tell you this, I never watched horror movies at work again. Story 7. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of dead quiet shift where I usually just refilled the coffee pots, stocked shelves, and chatted with the occasional trucker or cab driver. I worked night shifts at a gas station on the edge of town, right where the highway thins out into nothing but dark road and scattered woods. You'd think the nights would be peaceful, and they usually were, but this one wasn't. I was leaning on the counter talking to Sam, one of the regular cabbies who came by for coffee and a sandwich between runs. Sam was easygoing, the kind of guy who knew all the local gossip but didn't shove it down your throat. We were laughing about something stupid when this car rolled into the lot. The floodlights hit the glass hard, bright and blinding. I squinted, raising a hand to shield my eyes. The guy had parked facing directly into the store, lights on full blast like he was trying to blind us on purpose. Sam frowned and muttered, "What the hell's his problem?" "Probably forgot his brights," I said, brushing it off. "It happens. People get distracted. But this guy didn't kill the lights. He just sat there, engine idling, flooding the front of the store with that harsh white glare. 5 minutes passed, then another 2. My nerves started prickling. Finally, the door opened and he walked in. And right away, I knew something was off. The guy was jittery, his hands twitching like he had too much caffeine or was coming off something stronger. His clothes were wrinkled and grimy, his hair sticking out in wild tufts. But it was his eyes that got me, wide, bloodshot, and locked onto me like I was the only thing in the room. I'm 5'2" and friendly by default, the opposite of intimidating. I smile at everyone, even when I probably shouldn't, so I kept it polite. "Hey there, how's it going?" Nothing. He just stared, that creepy, unblinking stare as he paced aimlessly around the store. His movements were jerky, unpredictable, like he couldn't decide where he was going or why he was there. Eventually, he grabbed a coffee and shuffled up to the counter, still staring dead at me. "Just the coffee?" I asked, forcing a smile. No response. He slid a crumpled bill across the counter without saying a word. His hand brushed mine, and I swear his skin was ice cold, like he'd been standing out in the dead of winter, even though it was a mild night. "All right, have a good one," I said, trying to sound casual as I handed him his change. He didn't leave. He just stood there sipping his coffee, eyes never leaving me. It was like he was memorizing every inch of my face. I felt a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. Sam leaned casually on the counter, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "That guy's giving me the creeps," he said. "You want me to hang around a bit?" I nodded, grateful. "Yeah, maybe just a little." Sam stayed, sipping his coffee and making small talk like nothing was wrong, but I knew he was keeping an eye on the guy. So was I. The man wandered to the back of the store, pretending to browse the shelves but always turning back to watch me. I tried to ignore it, Focus on cleaning up, but my hands were shaking. Don't worry, Sam said quietly. If he pulls anything, I got your back. Minutes dragged by, and the guy just lingered, not buying anything else, not talking, just watching. Then, as if on cue, a couple of truckers pulled into the lot, their big rigs rumbling like thunder. The flood of headlights broke the tension. The man froze for a second, then walked back outside, coffee still in hand. I breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God, I muttered. But Sam didn't relax. He was still watching the guy through the glass. He's not leaving, he said grimly. Sure enough, the man had gotten back into his car, but instead of driving off, he parked facing the store again, lights off this time. He just sat there, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard. Want me to drive you home after your shift? Sam asked. I hesitated. You sure? He nodded. On the house. Call me when you're ready. I finished up my closing duties as fast as I could, my skin crawling with the weight of that unseen stare from the parking lot. Every time I glanced out the window, his silhouette was still there, unmoving. Finally, I locked the doors, heart pounding, and dialed Sam. He was there in minutes. Get in, he said, voice tight. As we pulled out of the lot, I couldn't help but look back. The man's car was still sitting there, engine idling like he was waiting for something, or someone. Sam drove me home in silence, but when we hit the dark back road near my place, his jaw clenched. You see that? What? He's behind us. I whipped around, heart leaping into my throat. There he was, headlights on full blast, tailing us way too close. The glare filled the cab, making it hard to see the road ahead. He's been doing that since we left the station, Sam said, his voice low and controlled. Stay calm. But I couldn't. My pulse was hammering. What the hell does he want? No idea, but we're not going straight to your place, Sam said firmly. I'm not leading this guy to your door. We took turns at random, weaving through back streets, trying to lose him. The lights stayed with us, burning bright, relentless. Then, without warning, they vanished. Sam pulled over, breathing hard. Gone, he said, disbelief in his voice. I stared back at the empty road, half expecting those lights to reappear out of the darkness. But they didn't. The night was still and quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. You okay? Sam asked. I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. He drove me the rest of the way home, waiting until I was safely inside before pulling away. I never saw that man again. Story 8. It was the dead of winter, and the amusement park had been closed for months. Snow clung stubbornly to the steel tracks of roller coasters, and frost bit at the edges of ticket booths. The rides stood frozen in time, their painted colors dull under the overcast sky. I worked security there during the off-season, mostly night shifts. Honestly, it was a cushy gig. Not much to do but make rounds and keep an eye out for trespassers. It was just me and another guard that night, Jared, both of us bundled in layers against the cold. We were the only ones in the entire park. I knew that for a fact. We were driving the park's utility cart, one of those rickety electric things that barely survived the bumps along the paved paths. Jared was behind the wheel, steering lazily as we made our way past the darkened food stands and motionless rides. I sat beside him, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos, trying to stay awake. Man, Jared said, exhaling a cloud of breath into the frigid air. This place is creepy as hell when it's empty. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Empty amusement parks have a weird energy, like they're just waiting for something to happen. The silence presses down on you, heavy and unnatural, like the place itself knows it shouldn't be quiet. We had just passed the Ferris wheel when the first phone rang. Jared hit the brakes and we both looked at each other. You hear that? He asked. Yeah. It was coming from the control booth for the ride. The sharp trill of an old landline echoed through the frozen air, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Jared frowned. Who the hell would be calling that phone? No clue, I said, my voice low. Those phones were only supposed to connect to the park's internal system, and no one was supposed to use them during the off-season. Hell, most of the phones probably didn't even work anymore. The ringing stopped just as suddenly as it had started. Jared shrugged and started driving again. We didn't even make it 20 feet before another phone started ringing. This time it was from the arcade building we were passing. Jared stopped the cart again, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. "What the fuck?" he muttered. The sound was crisp, echoing through the empty building. The phone rang 3 times and then went silent. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. "You think someone's messing with us?" I asked. "Who?" Jared shot back. "We're the only ones here." I didn't have an answer for that, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. We sat there for a moment, the silence creeping back in around us. Then Jared shook his head and muttered, "Screw it. Probably just a glitch or something." He pressed his foot down on the pedal, and the cart jerked forward. We hadn't even made it to the next bend when the phone in the haunted house started ringing. Jared slammed the brakes again, and we both stared at the dark entrance to the ride. The sound echoed eerily from inside, bouncing off the walls. "Okay," Jared said, his voice tight. "This is getting weird." "Weird," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's fucked up is what it is." The phone rang twice more, and then went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Maybe it's just a power surge," Jared said, though he didn't sound convinced. "You know, like the system's rebooting or something." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something about it felt wrong. We drove on, faster this time, trying to shake off the unease. But then another phone started ringing, and another. Every ride we passed, every building, it was like the phones were following us. They didn't all ring at once. That would have been easier to explain. No, it was one after the other, like a chain reaction, as if something, or someone, was tracking our movements through the park. "This is bullshit," Jared said, his voice trembling now. "We need to call this in." "To who?" I shot back. "There's no one else here." He didn't answer, just gritted his teeth and kept driving. We passed the bumper cars, the carousel, the log flume, each one marked by the eerie, persistent ringing of a phone. The sound was relentless, clawing at my nerves. By the time we reached the main entrance, my heart was pounding in my chest. Jared killed the engine, and we sat there in the suffocating silence. The phones had stopped ringing. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a shroud. "You hear anything now?" Jared finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, my mouth dry. We sat there listening, but there was nothing, just the cold wind rattling through the empty park. Jared exhaled shakily and rubbed a hand over his face. "Man, I'm never doing another night shift here again." "Yeah," I muttered, my voice hollow. "Me neither." We never did figure out what happened that night. The phones didn't ring again, and when we checked the system later, there was no record of any calls being made. It was like it never happened. But I know what I heard, and I'll never forget it. Story 9. I was a paramedic in a small Kentucky town. Not exactly the most exciting job most nights, but every now and then, something would happen that stuck with you. This story, I'll never forget it, no matter how hard I try. It was a nasty night, one of those full-blown summer thunderstorms that makes the power flicker and sets off every dog in the neighborhood. The roads were slick, visibility was garbage, and the radio crackled constantly from the static. Just past midnight, we got a call. Someone had found a guy dead in his truck out on a back road near the river. Dispatch said he'd been sitting there a while, long enough for rigor mortis to set in. We figured maybe a heart attack or stroke. That part wasn't unusual. What made it worse was the weather. Sheets of rain, lightning cracking across the sky like something out of a horror movie. I remember thinking, this is going to be a nightmare getting him out. We pulled up alongside the truck. It was one of those old beat-up Chevys with rust patches on the sides, parked crooked off the gravel shoulder like he'd just given up mid-drive. The windows were fogged up, but you could see him slumped back in the driver's seat, stiff as a board. The rain pounded against the roof of the ambulance, drowning out everything else. My partner, Greg, climbed out first. "This is gonna suck," he muttered as we threw on our rain gear. No kidding. We popped the door open, and there he was. Mid-50s, pale as a sheet, eyes half open but glazed over. His arms were frozen in this weird bent position, like he was gripping an invisible steering wheel. His legs were locked straight out. "Yep, he's gone," Greg said flatly. The hard part was getting him out of the truck. Rigor made everything awkward. Dead weight's one thing, but when they're stiff like that, it's like trying to wrestle a mannequin. We had to push and pull just to get his limbs straight enough to fit on the stretcher. All the while, the rain kept coming down in buckets, soaking us to the bone. Finally, we got him secured, strapped down nice and tight. By then, it was pushing 3 a.m., and the morgue wasn't going to be open until 4. Small town life for you. No 24-hour services. "Station or drive?" Greg asked as he hopped back into the driver's seat, dripping water all over the floor. "Let's just drive," I said. "Keep moving." Sitting still in that weather felt worse somehow. So we hit the road, wipers slapping against the windshield, the storm raging on outside. The dead guy lay in the back, silent and still under the sheet. I kept glancing back out of habit, but nothing moved. Just the dull hum of the tires on wet pavement and the occasional rumble of thunder. About 15 minutes in, Greg broke the silence. "Creepy, ain't it?" "Yeah," I admitted, "but it's just a body. Nothing to get weird about." I shouldn't have said that. We were cruising down this empty stretch of highway when it happened. Out of nowhere, I heard this low, guttural moan. At first, I thought maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But then it got louder. A deep, wet, horrible sound that cut through the storm noise like a knife. Greg slammed on the brakes. "What the hell was that?" I whipped around to look at the stretcher, and my heart nearly stopped. The dead guy, he was sitting up. Not just leaning forward or shifting from the bumps in the road. He was bolt upright, his back ramrod straight like someone had yanked him up by an invisible string. His mouth was wide open, that awful moan still echoing out of him. "Jesus Christ," Greg shouted, white-knuckling the steering wheel. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This man was dead, stone cold, rigor mortis and all. But there he was, moving like something out of a nightmare. I fumbled for the radio. "Dispatch. We've got..." I couldn't even form a sentence. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The moaning cut off like someone hit a switch. His body slumped back onto the stretcher with a sickening thud. Limbs twisted awkwardly again under the sheet. Dead. Completely dead. Greg and I just sat there in stunned silence, the rain pounding against the windshield. Neither of us said a word for what felt like forever. Finally, Greg cleared his throat. That didn't just happen, right?" I wanted to agree, to pretend we'd imagined the whole thing. But the sweat on my face wasn't from the heat, it was pure terror. "We're not talking about this," I said firmly, my voice shaking. "Ever." Greg nodded quickly. "Yeah, deal." We drove the rest of the way in silence, hearts racing, eyes darting to the back of the ambulance every few seconds. When we finally got to the morgue, the mortician was waiting for us, grumbling about being woken up so early. We didn't say a word as we wheeled the body inside. Story 10, I work night shifts at a psychiatric facility, which means I've seen more than my fair share of strange and unsettling things. People coming in high and psychotic, screaming about things that aren't there. Patients huddled naked in the corners of their rooms, whispering to themselves. You get used to it, or at least you think you do. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. I still get chills thinking about it. It started just past 2 a.m., the part of the shift where time stretches into this heavy, quiet haze. The patients were supposed to be asleep, and the nurse's station was calm. I was going over charts, half listening to the steady hum of the security monitors, when one of the patients walked up, barefoot and pale as a sheet. "There's someone outside my window," she said, her voice low but trembling. This patient, let's call her Sarah, was known for vivid hallucinations. Since admission, she'd been talking about shadow figures and strange voices that followed her around. So naturally, I assumed this was just another one of those moments. I tried to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "It's probably just the wind or shadows," I told her, "but we'll check it out, okay?" She nodded, but her wide, frightened eyes stuck with me. She wasn't just unsettled, she was genuinely terrified. Still, I figured going to her room and pulling back the curtain would help ease her mind. Another nurse, Jen, joined me as we walked down the dimly lit hall. The place was dead silent except for the occasional creak of the building settling. When we got to Sarah's room, the removable draw curtain over the window was completely shut. The outside floodlights cast a faint glow through the edges, but it was otherwise dark. "Is this the window you saw someone at?" I asked her. "Yes," she whispered. "He was right there, just staring at me." Jen shot me a glance, part skepticism, part concern. I knew what she was thinking. Typical hallucination. But we had to follow protocol and check it out. "All right," I said, trying to sound casual. "Let's have a look." I grabbed the edge of the curtain and hesitated for just a second. Something about the heaviness in the air made my skin prickle, but I brushed it off as nerves and yanked the curtain open in one swift motion. And that's when I saw him. A man was standing right there on the other side of the glass, wide-eyed and staring straight at us. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. He was pale with dark, wild hair, his face pressed close to the window, like he'd been waiting for us to look. His eyes, God, his eyes were wide and unblinking, like he was just as shocked to see us as we were to see him. Jen gasped and stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then he moved. Without a sound, he turned and bolted into the darkness, disappearing beyond the glow of the floodlights. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever. I could hear Sarah behind us, whispering, I told you he was there." Snapping out of it, I grabbed the radio on my belt. "Security, we've got an intruder on the east side near room 12, I said, my voice shaking. "Send someone now." Jen and I sprinted down the hall, adrenaline pumping as we tried to track where the guy might have gone. Security showed up within minutes, sweeping the perimeter with flashlights. The police were called too. They searched the grounds and checked the security footage. Nothing. It was like the guy had vanished into thin air. Sarah was moved to a different room for the rest of the night, and we did our best to calm her down. But honestly, I think we were more shaken than she was. The next day, they checked the window. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside. It didn't make sense. To this day, no one knows who that man was or how he got so close to a secured facility without being seen. We never saw him again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.